And we are live.
Welcome to Addiction Pal. I'm Logan.
And I'm Nate. And today we're going to talk about the 7 deadly sins.
So the 7 deadly sins is a topic that I really enjoy, and I'm very glad you brought it up because I'm so passionate about it. But what made you think of this topic to begin with?
I guess I was particularly thinking about lust. I was trying to write some sort of narrative down, exploring what kind of the nature of lust is. I was actually trying to figure out kind of how, I don't know, a succubus or an incubus would think. If that makes any sense.
What's the difference between a succubus and an incubus? What is an incubus?
An incubus is just the male version.
Oh, okay. That's cool. Fun fact.
So I guess I was trying to contrast lust from the other sins, and so maybe it would help if, since I know you're a lot more into this kind of thing, you have some experience, I don't know, differentiating between them.
Right. Okay. So let's break down the 7 sins first. So we've got lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride make up the 7 deadly sins. And this list has been used in a lot of different movies, like the movie, was it called Sin or 7 Deadly Sins? One with Brad Pitt?
I'm not familiar.
Oh, well, there was one about the 7 Deadly Sins with Brad Pitt. There is an anime called the 7 Deadly Sins, and an anime, Full Metal Alchemist. They use them every now and then in other random pieces of writing that I see. There will be a kind of indirect, or I guess less direct, sightings of the 7 Deadly Sins. So I've always been interested in it because of the things that I saw with that. And they've always made sense to me, although I have played with the idea of the list being different. And of course, everybody's going to define sin differently depending on your religion and your moral beliefs, etc. But one of the things that you talked about was how lust and gluttony seem to overlap somehow, right?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not specifically fascinated by the 7 deadly sins like you, but I do have a sort of preoccupation when people try to, in their own way, divide up the universe into different categories. So I'm fascinated from that perspective with things like the Infinity Stones in the Avengers story, or I don't know. You could even talk about like breaking the world into fundamental elements, or things like earth, fire, wind, water, that kind of stuff. So I guess when I look at a categorization of the universe, or any sufficiently comprehensive topic that's complicated to me, at least, I kind of think along the lines of, are the different categories mutually exclusive, and are all of the categories together exhaustive of that category? So are there questions I would ask specifically about the 7 deadly sins would be, are there any sins that fall outside of those 7, or do they kind of break the world of sin into 7 realms, and there's nowhere else? And then I also am interested in areas of overlap, and in particular, it seems like if we're going to count them, I want to make sure that we can't in any way reduce their number. So obviously, if one of these sins, using kind of the region analogy, is like a state within the nation of another sin, then it's just a subcategory, and so we can kind of think about it like that. So I guess I was maybe particularly interested in lust in contrast with things like greed and envy and gluttony, because it seems like greed might be about amassing some sort of thing. um, I mean, typically it's money, but it could be whatever they consider to be valuable. So maybe seashells or something, if that's what they're into. Um, and then envy seems to be about uh, kind of wanting something that someone else has because they have it, and which is different. Um, and then gluttony seems kind of fundamentally consumptive. So the way I kind of think about it is that the greedy person wants to have their cake, whereas the gluttonous person wants to eat it.
Right.
And so I was trying to understand lust, because lust, I'm not sure, has to do very much with wanting something because someone else has it. That you could just as easily lust after your neighbor's wife as you could lust after her before she was ever married. Um, Whereas you would envy your neighbor for having maybe such a wife, but you could only do that before, like he had, or after he had her. You couldn't do that before, right?
Right.
So it seems like lust is not really an envy, and so I was kind of wondering if lust is about the act of like experiencing a person in the same way of gluttony being the way of experiencing I don't know, food and drink or something.
So I think part of this comes down to pleasure, which actually we've talked about before, about a year ago now. So, for example, with gluttony, it would typically be the pleasure of food and overindulging in that pleasure of food. So, just keep on eating because eating makes you feel good. And I see that being a similarity with lust. Obviously, sex is pleasurable. So, you're overindulging in the pleasures of sex. I can get that. But I'm thinking in terms of material. I guess matter cannot be destroyed, but it can be kind of turned into energy, right? And that's sort of what eating is, right? You're taking matter and you're turning it into energy.
You're taking the energy from the chemicals and whatnot.
Yeah. So I feel like so there's actually the closest thing, as far as I know, besides like antimatter or dark matter or whatever, of destroying matter would be to like kind of turning it into energy or transferring it to energy. Whereas I feel like with lust, there's nothing actually being consumed. You're just indulging in a desire. So that's the only real difference that I see. But I do feel like there is some overlap there with indulging in a pleasurable experience or indulging because of the action being pleasurable.
Yeah, so I think one of the good points that you made was that sometimes it helps in trying to identify the boundaries of a sin by thinking of its opposite.
Yeah,
Do you want to say more about that?
sure. So there are the four cardinal virtues, but that's not what personally I'm as interested in. And also, in terms of looking at the seven deadly sins, I think it is better to look at the seven contrary virtues, we can call them for maybe lack of a better term. So the contrary virtue to lust would be chastity. It seems to make sense. If you want to not give in to your lustful desires, you just simply don't. You are chaste and do not have sex. Gluttony, the virtue for that is temperance, which is one that I find very interesting, which we can talk about more in a second. But that basically means moderation. Greed's opposite is charity or generosity, as I would rather call it. The opposite of sloth is diligence. The opposite of wrath is patience. The opposite of envy is kindness. And those last two I think are interesting as well. And the opposite of pride is humility.
Yeah, so
So
I guess it's interesting because uh, if I gave you a list of those virtues, and I don't know, it would be again some sort of dividing up of all the different regions of the realm of virtue. Um, and yet it wasn't immediately obvious to me why each of those would be the opposite of each of the sins.
yeah, so the fact that these are considered the contrary virtues, so in other words, the opposite, like do this thing to avoid sinning, or I guess that's not even completely accurate because it's like this is the opposite. This is not supposed to be only about not sinning, but it's supposed to be about doing good. So if there was a spectrum, for example, and dead in the middle is being neither virtuous nor sinful, uh, that would be neutrality, right? But the virtues are talking about going on the complete opposite end of the scale is sin. So the opposite being progressive, which I think some of these are pretty on the money, but some of them aren't. For example, chastity, I feel like chastity is just completely neutral and it's not uh, really doing anything more. Like I would put that right in the middle of the spectrum. If, of course, you're going to agree with the premise that lust is a sin. So, how do you stop giving into your lustful desires? You are chaste. But wait a minute, is that really positively benefiting anybody? Is that really being virtuous?
So you're saying on the spectrum, if you put lust at -100, negative because it's bad, um, then you would put chastity at 0?
Yeah, that's to me, that's how I see it because all chastity is not doing something. Whereas, say, let's look at greed and charity, for example. Greed would be, let's say, -100. Uh, I'd say maybe something more of moderation would be 0, and then charity would be uh, 100 because you're giving away what you have to other people. Whereas something closer to 0 would be you're not giving anything to anybody, but you're not taking more than what you deserve either.
So what would you say is 100 for the lust chastity scale?
I have no idea. I don't know if there is one. I guess maybe running around and beating up rapists or something. Like I don't know how that would really work. So or maybe there's something in here where maybe the scale of lust is more like a circle. So there's chastity is um, uh, dead in the center of doing nothing. Lust would be maybe having sex out of lustful intentions, and maybe the far right would be having sex with somebody you love and sharing a romantic relationship with them and giving into the loving desire rather than the lustful desire. I could see that maybe being uh, the scale because people often talk about the difference between lust and love and like infatuation and love and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this scale also is going back to greed and charity is what happens when a very generous person, a very charitable person, say takes this virtue to 100, and then they have nothing left. And now they're somebody who needs charity themselves. So again, I feel like there's a flaw with this, because how do you define charity? How do you define what is enough charity? Which is why I liked the word generosity better than charity. And I think that knowing exactly what limits we're talking about, keeping enough to sustain yourself, maybe even keeping what you deserve, and giving away excess might be a better way of being the opposite of greed. Because greed is, I guess at maybe level 100, is taking everything you can. But I think somewhere between 0 and negative 100 is just taking more than you need.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas with charity, I'd say, between 0 and 100, it's giving away excess of what you need. And then hitting 100 is you gave away too much.
Yeah, so I guess I think it's interesting how people define virtues. I was pleased to find out that there was a list of 7 virtues, because I was worried that they would end up being just like some sort of simple negation, and that seems kind of lazy. Like the virtue corresponding to sloth is don't do nothing or something. That just seems not very well defined. Whereas something like being industrious or diligent or something is a lot more positive and meaningful somehow to me. So I think the when we're talking about the scale here, where charity might have gone too far, reminds me of Aristotle's theory of virtue. Is that basically virtue is always a mean between 2 extremes, and so uh, courage is not on one end of extreme end of a spectrum against uh, cowardice or something, but it's actually in between, maybe some sort of having your behavior being dominated by fear, and on the other hand being like reckless, uh, and that courage is somehow a good compromise in between. Um, and so that's maybe how people would particularly think about something like temperance. So gluttony is obviously eating too much. The other extreme would be, I don't know, starving yourself.
Right.
And so then the virtue of temperance is eating what is necessary to sustain your body, and nothing more and nothing less.
So if we took this back to the scale again, and let's use gluttony and temperance, because I agree that temperance is maybe my favorite, or one of my favorite kind of counters to the sin, just because I feel like it really hits right down the middle of where you're supposed to be. Because, as you said, you can overeat, and that can obviously lead to health problems and perhaps other problems as well. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you undereat, you're malnourished, uh, and that obviously leads to more problems as well. So temperance, I feel like, is a great way to put it. But if we went back to our scale and we said that gluttony is negative 100 and temperance is positive 100, then our scale doesn't seem to be right anymore. So I feel like we have a problem where our list of virtues is inconsistent if they were all to be put on a similar scale, because we have some that are where I feel like the virtue is actually at 0, like temperance. You want to get close to that middle ground as you can. But then we have other ones like charity, where that word and that idea seems to go towards positive 100 instead of closer to 0. So,
And yet, even with charity, you were saying that there's a certain point past which it's actually a bad thing because you become dependent in some way. You've given away too much.
Right. You give away so much that now all of a sudden you're the one in need of charity. And that's pointless. You're creating more, uh, I guess you're creating more opportunity for other people to be virtuous by spreading their charity. But if, then I think, I guess we might go down the rabbit hole a little bit, which is what we're supposed to do on this show, right? um, well, I guess come out of the rabbit hole, but if everybody is aiming to be charitable like that and everybody just keeps giving away everything all the time, then people are going to be more tempted to rely on that charity, and then they might give into sloth because they won't feel like they have a need to work for what they want. So, or sorry, work for what they deserve. So that could just generate more problems down the line. But yeah, in short, charity has an extreme, which is bad. And the opposite of gluttony, which would be not eating at all, like, I don't know, extreme fasting or just, any kind of starvation would be bad as well. So temperance is in the middle.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's a particularly poor conception of charity if it ultimately facilitates something like sloth.
Yeah, exactly.
That
Because
one of the popular forms of charity that we have in contemporary capitalism is like a buy one give one strategy.
sure.
So they, I don't know, you maybe the most popular one is like Tom's shoes or whatever, but
Yeah,
there's plenty of those kinds of products, and what they've found is that what that act of quote unquote charity ultimately does is it makes obsolete whatever shoe manufacturing that was going on in the target of donation, and then people lose their jobs, and so they have shoes but they don't have jobs anymore. And
right.
uh, so it's a situation where it doesn't seem to be true charity if the recipient of your charity ends up worse off. That a truly charitable act somehow builds people up. You know, it's the difference between giving a man a fish and teaching a man to fish.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also, I think almost everybody in life at some point they need help of some kind. Humans are social creatures. We all need help, whether it's monetary help, whether it's help physically when we're ill or injured, or whether it's emotional help and stability. We humans are socially dependent on one another for a reason. We're kind of pack animals in a certain sense. So I think in that sense, being charitable is good. Like when someone needs help, you help them. But if you're just constantly helping people who don't need help all the time, all you're really doing is enabling them to be, you sloth, if we're talking about the sins.
Right. So I guess that brings me back to lust and chastity, because unlike something like gluttony and temperance, where it seems like, coming from a perspective of that kind of extremism. Let's say someone wants to avoid gluttony uh, at all costs. Well, they can't not eat or drink. That's not going to work for them if they're going to have any sort of long life. Um,
They,
Now, someone
they could
could,
do it for a month.
right. Someone could do a similar thing with lust and do pretty well. They could live a full life uh, by just maintaining a certain abstinence from any sort of sexual stimulation whatsoever. But obviously, that can't be applied very effectively across the human species, because that's sexual reproduction is necessary. right now and has been for a long time for the continuation of our species. So we can't have total abstinence if the species is going to survive, but you can in individual circumstances. So that kind of makes it seem to me like chastity, like maybe there is nothing more, nothing further on the other side of chastity from lust, that it is an extreme. Obviously, if it's an extreme and not a mean between extremes, Aristotle is not going to like it. But I think that kind of says something to me about the difference in the natures between gluttony and lust. That lust can in some way be avoided in a way that gluttony, someone who has some sort of eating disorder, they can't get around that every day of their life. Whereas if you have some sort of sexual disorder, you presumably could.
So I'm thinking, and this is, again, I'm rabbit holing here. If we went way off the deep end with the kind of say on a global scale, this chastity thing, technically, I think we do have the technology today or we could at least figure it out, to, with zero sexual impulse whatsoever, procreate in a lab still. So we could possibly make 100% of the planet chaste, but still procreate as long as we use science, which I feel like would really upset a lot of people, saying that technology is the answer, considering how things like these sins are so old and sacred to a lot of people. So a lot of the times technology is kind of like the anti-religion, I feel like.
Yeah. And I guess I am interested. My original question had to do with kind of getting inside the mind of an incubus. Because I think you said before that the opposite of lust is not just chastity, because chastity is just doing nothing. What would be going further would be to, take on rapists or something, right?
Yeah.
But it seems to me like a phenomenon that I've heard is that rapists are not, it's not actually about sexual desire as much as it's about power and control.
Yes.
And so in that case, I'm not sure if how much a rapist actually lusts versus maybe it's more wrath or something. And so then again, we get into this question of the ultimate lust type creature, which, I'm talking about a sex demon here. That's like so extremely sinful. It's fantastical, right?
Right.
Uh, and so if you
Mystical.
were going to instantiate uh, the ultimate lust creature, how would it think? How would it operate?
Yeah, so if it's pure lust and that's all it is, uh, I feel like lust is more of like an instinct or emotion rather than an action. So it just a succubus being a succubus, just like being this tempting embodiment of sex. I don't think that really does anything. That's not even really a sin at that point. It's not a sin until you give in to the lust, right? Or is lust itself the sin? But if lust itself was the sin and you were chaste, I got a feeling that being chaste would be pretty counterproductive, because your desire for sex would just build up and build up and build up.
Right. Yeah. So it seems interesting what you were saying about like a sex demon would involve temptation. So then it's not really about the sex demon's lust. It's about how it invokes lust, how it evokes it from other people.
Right.
So
this is making me think also of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm about to quote Harry Potter or try to, but I think Dumbledore said something along the lines of, uh, it's our actions that define us. In other words, not our thoughts. Like everybody has bad thoughts. It's what you actually do that defines you,
Right.
which I have a lot of conflicting feelings on that. But if we're talking about action versus lust, because I think that all of these sins have a mix of both somehow. So sloth, for example, would be a lack of action, but you can still feel lazy. And wrath, you can feel angry, but I think wrath kind of encapsulates the idea that you're going to actually lash out at someone. And envy, I don't think is just being envious of someone. I think it means reacting in a way that is envious. I think it has that implication. And pride isn't just about being proud of yourself, it's carrying yourself in a way that doesn't recognize that anybody's helped you. So lust, though, to me, I guess you could have the implication that it means giving into the lust, especially when you look at the contrary virtue. But then again, how does love play into that? And if we're talking about a sex demon that is just the pure embodiment of sex, how much of it is just the temptation? And is it your actions that define you, or is it actually the feeling that you have that you need to make peace with and squash out and, I don't know, channel into something positive internally?
Yeah, because it seems like, unlike a lot of these other sins, lust involves a some sort of communion with another human, and so it's kind of a it's not so much a singular sin in that regard. That that part of the acting on lust means involving the lust of another.
And then there's, even if we wanted to uh, entertain the premise that lust and love are contrasting, people who take advantage of those who are actually experiencing love and the other one's not. These would be sort of like players, right? They
Right.
play your emotions. So they're giving into their lust by taking advantage of somebody else's love. Is that not worse than two mutual lusters? And would that be a different
Yeah.
sin at that point?
Yeah, it seems to me like that is something that's involved in the sin in the domain of lust, is taking advantage of other people who are innocent. So maybe particularly would be, I don't know, lusting after virgins or something, taking people who were chaste their whole life and somehow corrupting them.
That would make sense if we were going to, especially if we're going to consider that the contrary virtue is chastity.
And so getting back to gluttony is consumptive, because you're taking food and turning it into waste. In that way, lust might be consumptive of virginity, which is an intangible, arguably a social construct or whatever. Um, but it
Although,
still seems to
al-
be something that's consumed.
yeah, and although with women too, there's the breaking of the hymen happens oftentimes with uh, virgin
Right,
women, right?
right.
So there is technically like a piece of the body or flesh that is not being consumed as in eaten, but as in being destroyed or taken away or removed.
Yeah, and even if you remove, the so it seems like virginity is maybe something that could be consumed, but then also lust seems to me to be about maybe more like having a sexual partner that you haven't had before. Um, some sort of lusting after someone else's I don't know, sexual energy or something that that you're trying to, add one more notch to your bedpost in that sense. And so that kind of conquest seems also a little bit consumptive.
I saw a TED talk recently, actually, that had to do with new research on pornography addiction. And although most of that could be a different topic for another day, or we never really have to talk about it,
Mhm.
but one of the points that was brought up with that is what you just said, which is the human brain, at least in males. I only say males because it's all that was studied in this TED talk. Different partners trigger a particular response in the male human brain, I suppose. So it's like that's one of the reasons why pornography can become so addictive, is because you can see so many different partners.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a phenomenon in other parts of nature as well. I think I've uh, seen some sort of evidence that if you take uh, if you take sheep, males will have a drop off in how interested they are in intercourse with the same female. But if you keep switching the female on the male, it will basically keep having sex to physical exhaustion. Um,
Wow.
so, so there is some sort of biological driver where maybe males in particular would want to have as many different partners as possible to try to spread your genetic material. Um, but I think that if you can find that TED talk, that would be a great thing to put in the link to this video.
Yeah, I can do that. So let's break it down. This list: 7 deadly sins, 7 contrary virtues. Do we think it's a good list? What would we change about it? What would we not change about it?
Well, I think that the interesting thing to me is that, as you said, there's also a competing 4 cardinal virtues. So again, there's another way of kind of divvying up the different parts of virtue, and one of those cardinal virtues is temperance. So is temperance 1/4 or 1/7 of all of virtue? That seems to me to be a contention between those two systems. So we could potentially try to narrow down the 7 sins to be some sort of opposites of those 4 cardinal virtues, and we could get 4 sins.
That is definitely possible. I'm also looking at temperance, and so according to temperance and the contrary virtues, it is talking specifically about gluttony. And I don't know if you knew this going into this or not, but I certainly didn't. Temperance, according to the cardinal virtues, seems to also have to do with lustful desire as well, or at least I think that there would be an argument that could be made that it could be contributed into that.
Yeah,
So, which begs the question from the very, very beginning. One of the first things that we said is, how closely related are lust and gluttony? It seems like everything that we've talked about so far, we couldn't really put a dead split on lust being its perfectly own thing, encompassing its own unique sin entirely. There's always something about temptation in there or indulgence in there. So just the fact that we had to talk about it so much, I feel like hints at maybe it shouldn't be its own thing. Maybe it could be combined into something like gluttony, for example. And if
yeah,
we look at the contrary part of it, if we want to go with something that's more moderate, we talked about chastity, temperance, and charity in particular. Temperance is a moderation word. Charity needs some kind of moderation word for it, which what would that be in prudence maybe, or justice? I don't know.
I think so.
Okay, so I don't know if we made a list of the cardinal virtues yet, but that'd be prudence, courage, temperance, and justice.
Yes, uh, and from what I'm familiar with Plato, it becomes very interesting to me, because those all don't seem to be exactly mutually exclusive from each other either. Um, that, for instance, in Plato's Republic, he talks about a just society is one that breaks up its citizens into three categories: one for prudence, one for courage, one for temperance. Um, and so justice in that sense is well ordering your city state into the three other virtues. So
Well, something interesting about that is I've seen this kind of theme come up frequently in uh, pieces of writing that
mhm,
has to do with the seven deadly sins.
mhm,
Pride is very often kind of its own thing, or it's kind of the ultimate sin. And a lot of arguments that come through these writing pieces are that there is no sin that happens without pride. So you can't be slothful without pride, maybe because you feel like you don't have to work because you're above it, or you're greedy
mhm.
because you feel like you deserve it because you feel above other people. So the idea is that you're giving into the other sins because of pride in particular. So I guess pride would uh, some of these pieces argue is an umbrella over the rest of sin.
Interesting.
So when I see justice, or when you talked about justice, kind of almost similarly as an umbrella, you want to adjust society. Society, they kind of cover the umbrella, right?
Mhm.
And then break its citizens into three categories.
Yeah, and I think that one of my favorite kind of instantiations of uh, another variant on the cardinal virtues, prudence, courage, and temperance, is the Serenity Prayer, which I think is maybe particularly big in Alcoholics Anonymous, but I like it entirely independent of alcoholism and whatever. Because if you replace prudence with wisdom, and if you replace temperance with serenity, then the prayer goes, God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom, so I guess prudence, uh, to know the difference
Ah,
between what I can and cannot change. And that's my favorite prayer, uh, easily, because when I pray it, I think, when I think about the serenity, I'm like, okay, these are parts of my life that I need to let go or whatever. And then when I think about courage, my chest fills up and I get inspired to act on the things that I can change for the better, right?
right.
And then the last line comes and it's the wisdom to know the difference. And I'm like, oh, JK, I didn't know anything. Uh, I don't necessarily have the wisdom to differentiate the first part and the second part of what I need to act on and what I need to not. Um, and I think that it ultimately is a very humbling prayer for me, which if humility is the opposite of pride, then I guess it's a good prayer. Um, but that's interesting because if serenity is likened to temperance and temperance is a sort of restraint, then it totally makes sense why that's so important to alcoholism. Um, and I think that if we can combine things like chastity and temperance into one thing, I think that it's nice because then the sin isn't predicated on the object of its desire. Because if lust is about desire of sex and gluttony is about desire of food, then the opposite of them is restraint with respect to those objects. Then it seems like kind of generalizing temperance to just be self restraint, moderation, tempering appetites of all sorts, sexual appetites, or appetites for food or drink. I think that is somehow conceptually simpler to deal with because then you could think about, any sort of human appetite, not just food, drink. Uh, you could start talking about an appetite for sleep, and so then we can kind of break into the world of sloth or something. Um,
So one of the things that I was thinking about when you said that is I agree, and I like that idea that we aren't talking about the object, but we're talking about the kind of way to combat it.
mhm,
So think about temperance holistically. I really like that idea. Instinctually, what my reaction was to say, but it might be easier for some people to see what the contrary virtues are because maybe they don't have a problem indulging in some things, but they do have a problem indulging in sex, for example. So maybe it might be easier for them to see, like, okay, here's how I fix this, as you called it, like an object problem.
mhm.
I don't have a problem with giving into overeating, but I do have a problem of giving into sexual desires. But that's also kind of covered in the cardinal virtues by prudence or wisdom.
Mhm.
So that's the whole point. So I guess if you, and again, everything clicks with everybody in different ways. But I think if you really understood the cardinal virtues, I think it seems, or at least it seems like the more I hear about the cardinal virtues and the more you explain them, the more I'm on team cardinal virtues in that I think it does kind of cover all the bases in a nice, neat package.
Yeah.
One thing that you brought up that I really want to talk about too is since one of our original questions before we started this last bit was, would we change the list? And we talked about the cardinal virtues on the virtue side, but what about the sin side? Because you've mentioned Alcoholics Anonymous a few times, and that was in
Mhm.
terms of gluttony. But to me, we're opening a whole new beast here because I think overindulgence of food, we're talking about objects, is extremely different than overindulgence of alcohol, extremely different than overindulgence of drugs. Like, I mean, all the different kinds of drugs.
Yeah.
And uh, so let's just say some other basic ones. There's food and alcohol we've already talked about. What about marijuana? That is a huge thing going on in this country right now. And uh, I wonder if I bring that up and I can just hear somebody immediately saying, marijuana is not addictive. Yeah, well, neither is food. So that's not the point. The, the point is it is indulging in something that makes you feel good.
So would you suggest we need an eighth sin for desire for a lack of sobriety?
Well, I don't know. Or uh, maybe that, or maybe gluttony needs to be better defined. I personally would like the idea of another sin for that, just because my views on alcohol and drinking and all that stuff is very different. But then I kind of don't want to break that off into another thing because then I feel like I'll just be pulling a lust. Like I'm starting to get more on the side of why can't you combine lust with gluttony and then put all this other stuff in there too and be like, don't give in to temptation, because I feel like those tempting things to indulge in are all very similar, although the objects are different. Like you said, I think the root of the problem is the same.
Yeah, so I guess I was just trying to respond to your claim that gluttony with respect to food is different than gluttony with respect to alcohol. So if if it's different enough that mainly I'm concerned about the remedy for these sins. So if the course of action for how to deal with gluttony is very different, if it's about food versus drink, then there's that. So it
Right,
also
yeah.
seems to me like uh, someone who has some sort of eating disorder probably should follow a different regimen than someone who seems to have some sort of sex addiction type thing.
Sure. And I think part of this kind of reminds me of sometimes you go to the doctor and they can't treat the disease, but they treat the symptoms.
Hmm.
So maybe with some of these things, it's impossible to treat the disease, but you can only treat the symptoms. And then maybe by treating the symptoms, you eventually heal on your own. So, you have the flu, you can't take antibiotics. That's going to hurt you, but you can take a fever reducer, which can make you feel better and give your body the strength that it needs to recover on its own. So I do think that there is a point to specifying what kind of gluttony you are dealing with, but I don't know if it deserves its own thing because, again, I think the root of it is the same. So maybe there should be like gluttony and then a bunch of subcategories.
Well, I think you already mentioned to me in our previous conversation before this recording that greed has two variants. One that involves basically hoarding your wealth, and the other is spending it foolishly. Um,
Yeah, and I really wish I could find where I saw that. It's been like 10 years since I saw that. I know it's a thing that I saw. I just don't know how to look it up. But yeah,
but it
there
seems like that
was.
would be a way to break up gluttony into subcategories. Gluttony with respect to this object versus the other object.
Yeah, exactly. So I yeah, to wrap up gluttony, I totally agree. I think gluttony could be combined with lust. I think that chastity goes out the window and we just say temperance. And I think gluttony has a bunch of subcategories because I think gluttony is very, very extensive. And I also think that maybe gluttony could be reworded. I think there's a better word out there. I don't know what it is, but I bet there is another word out there that would better encompass all that.
Hmm.
Maybe indulgence.
Yeah. Well, we'd also like our listeners to give their input on how they think this list of sins could be changed. Um, I think that you brought up a lot of other topics that would make good conversations entirely on their own.
Yeah, we could definitely do something else that we talked about when, one of our trips down the rabbit hole during this conversation or anything else. So if you guys listening have any input on our podcast today or have any idea about what you would like to hear about next, leave a comment in the comment section below and we will discuss it on the next episode.
All right.
Peace.